Joanna's going to come and speak to us, and as you'll all know, she's been our MP since 2015. She's one of the strongest women's voices that I've heard in Westminster, certainly. She's the SNP spokesperson for Justice and Home Affairs. She sits on the Human Rights Committee and the Exiting the European Union Committee at Westminster. So who better to talk to us today about human rights and Brexit? So I give you Joanna Cherry.
Right, well, I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I have got involved in politics, because I know this being organised as a women's event might be of particular interest to women here, but also to people who are interested in politics, and like me, were not really involved in it till quite recently. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to look around the room and see the faces of so many people who helped me to get re-elected last year. I was just saying to Karen when I came in, I was just remembering around about this time last year, we had a big election campaign event here when the First Minister came to visit this community centre as part of my campaign. And let's be honest, you know, it was a very strong fight I had with the Tories, and they were absolutely convinced that they'd won this seat. And that night at Meadowbank, those of you who were there at the count, they thought they'd won. They were astonishingly confident. And Ruth Davidson was up on the balcony, ready to make her big victory speech as her wee pal Miles defeated me, but of course they didn't. We actually won by 1,097 votes. And I think it's worth, and I'm not tooting my own trumpet here, it's worth reminding all of us that we were one of 15 Tory target seats, only 2 survived. All of the Tories got all those seats they targeted, apart from me and Pete Wishart. And we've got a majority of 1,097, poor Pete's just got 27. I think we need to give ourselves a massive pat in the back, that in an area which until just a few years ago was not an SNP seat, where we went from 4th place to 1st place in 2015, we managed to dig ourselves in sufficiently here in Edinburgh South West that we survived a major onslaught. And that is in no small part to many of the people, due to many of the people sitting in this room, and I really do remember that. I don't just forget about it and then come desperately looking for you next time there's a general election. God forbid that that should happen soon. Although, let's face it, the Tories are in a bit of a mess at the moment. I'll go on to say a bit about that later. So, of course, as Karen said, I got elected in the SNP landslide in 2015, and again, many of you were involved in that campaign. And I mean, that was really quite an incredible thing to be involved in. I mean, some people said you could have put a sack of potatoes up with an SNP rosette in it and it would have got elected in 2015. And I hope that's not true. And I think a lot of it was down to the swing, but it was also down to very hard individual campaigning, hitting the doorsteps and actually speaking to people about what we were all about. And for me, it's really been a whirlwind, because I sometimes feel that at some point towards the end of the referendum, the independence referendum, I popped out to buy a pint of milk, never came back, and then suddenly woke up one morning and realised I was an SNP MP, and I'm not quite sure how that came about. But in a sense, for me, it had a sort of inevitability, because I was brought up in quite a nationalist household. My mum's Irish, and she always says she tried hard not to turn her daughters into rampant Irish nationalists, and instead they've turned into rampant Scottish nationalists. But my dad, I think, was always a Labour man until Winnie's victory in 1967. And I remember him thinking that was impossible and then being really inspired by it. So I very much grew up as somebody who was interested in politics in the 70s, listening to my dad talk about the SNP, talk about the 11 that were elected in 1974. I remember going to school with a yes sticker on my badge and the Assembly referendum on my bag in 1978, and getting pelters from a lot of people over that. You know, sometimes nothing ever really changes in Scotland. And I remember vividly the sense of terrible depression that people felt after that referendum in 1978. And I think it's really important to reflect on how, although there were the dark years under Thatcher, how much things can change in the space of a couple of decades. You know, just under 20 years later, we went ahead to have that huge victory in the devolution referendum in 1997, which I think is really largely down to nationalists. And I know there's many good people in the Labour Party and the Lib Dems who are absolutely dedicated to devolution, but I think the pushing of the SNP and the voice of the SNP very much helped deliver devolution. And it's interesting now that it's falling to us as the SNP to defend devolution while the other parties cave into this power grab, or are at best a bit mealy-mouthed and divided on it. When I was a teenager, I actually joined the Young Scottish Nationalists, and I used to go to meetings in Edinburgh on a Saturday morning with a young Ian Blackford and a young John Swinney, when both of them had a bit more of their hair than they have now. I've kept mine, I'm glad to say. And I remember also when I was a teenager going to a meeting in Flora Stevenson's primary with my dad when Gordon Wilson was speaking, when he was leader of the SNP. Now, there's many things that I would have disagreed about with Gordon Wilson about latterly, particularly, for example, on equal marriage. But I think he was a great leader of the SNP and a very skilled politician, and it was a great tragedy when he died last year. Not particularly old nowadays, he went in his 70s. But I remember meeting Gordon Wilson when he was speaking at Flora Stevenson's when I was a wee girl, and I was really interested in politics. I wanted to be an MP, and so my dad took him up afterwards to introduce me to him, and I told him I wanted to be an MP, and he said, basically, forget it, go and get yourself a proper job, and then come back in your 40s when you'll be more used to us. And I'm afraid by somewhat of a more circuitous route, I've actually, but in a way he was right, I've ended up doing that, and I did actually spend about 10 years as a Labour Party member in the meantime, before coming back to what I think is probably my natural home in the SNP. And I often, the night I got elected, actually, I thought about Gordon Wilson's advice, because I think after the independence referendum, the person who was very instrumental in persuading myself and a lot of other SNP MPs to give up our jobs and careers and put ourselves forward was Alec Salmond. And I think Alec really saw what a lot of us didn't see in the immediate aftermath of the independence referendum, which was that although we'd lost the referendum, with that 45%, if we could keep that vote solid and maybe even add a bit to it, we could win nearly every seat in Scotland. Now, nobody, I think, ever really believed that was possible apart from Alec, and even Alec didn't think we'd win as many as 56. But it was really very much his idea, and I know a lot of us of the 56 and who's left of the 35 would not be MPs if it hadn't been for Alec persuading us to put ourselves forward for vetting and for a selection process, because he felt it was really important. Whereas it was good to have in the group some people who had been MSPs and some people who had been councillors who had that sort of political experience. It was also really important to put forward to the electorate people who had had a life outside politics, people who had worked in business or in the health service, or in my case as a lawyer, rather than just a bunch of people who'd done nothing but politics since they'd left school. And I think that's one of the reasons that we were able to get rid of so many of those useless Labour MPs that were sitting pretty, or as they thought, in those seats in Scotland, because we had candidates with CVs and backgrounds which sort of spoke to the people who were being asked to change their lifelong party allegiances to elect us. And I will say, one of the things I learned during the referendum, during the independence referendum, and again during both the big Westminster campaigns I've been involved in and also the Holyrood campaign, is the absolute importance for us, for me as an elected politician, for us as SNP activists, or people interested in engaging with the public about politics, of actually getting out and speaking to people. The huge importance of getting out and getting our message across on the doorsteps, knocking doors, and also going to community events. I've just come from a world, I think it's called World Disco Soup Day in Wester Hailes, which had its compensations as I got a lot of free soup and vegetables. But I think that's one of the reasons why the SNP has got such a strong toehold in this corner of Edinburgh in the southwest with councillors, an MSP and an MP, because we as a party and we as the elected officials do actually go out and speak to people and go to lots of community events. But I often look back at how things have really changed, and many of you will know that I've got a constituency office in Fountain Bridge, just opposite the big cinema complex. And I don't know if any of the rest of you were at this, but I went to the launch of the Yes campaign on the 25th of May 2012, nearly 6 years ago, in that big cinema complex across the road from where is now my office. And if you had said to me that within 3 or 4 years I would be opening an office across the road as an SNP Member of Parliament, I would have said that you were completely off your head. Because at that stage, although I was a member of the party, I had no intention of standing to be an MP. I really thought there wouldn't be an SNP MP in my lifetime in the city of Edinburgh, never mind 4 as there were and 3 as there are now. So I suppose what I'm saying is, it's always important to realise how quickly things can change in politics. In 2012, when I went to that launch of the Yes campaign, I think the support for independence in the opinion polls was at about 25%. And many commentators, some faint hearts like myself, were dreading the independence referendum because I thought we were going to get a real gubbing. But then things really took off and we nearly won. And I am one of the people who holds the view that we probably were ahead that weekend of that infamous opinion poll that put us slightly ahead, and that we fell back and lost because of the vow. But in a sense, that's ancient history. I don't really want to dwell on that too much. I think what we have to do now is to focus upon how we move forward to persuading a majority of our fellow countrymen and women, and by that I don't mean people born in Scotland, I mean people who live in Scotland, how we persuade the majority of the people who live in Scotland that independence is the best option, and we must do so in a respectful way, and we must do so in a way that gives people the confidence to embrace what is the natural state of affairs for most small nations in Western Europe. And it's very interesting, I think, at present to reflect on the economic growth figures that have just come out, I think yesterday or today, for the last quarter, when growth across the United Kingdom is at 0.1%. Now, no doubt we'll probably find out that growth in Scotland is at 0.5%, and the Scottish Government will be berated because growth is less in Scotland. But of course, the Scottish Government is not solely responsible for the Scottish economy. In fact, most of the macroeconomic levers that enable people to grow an economy, lie at Westminster. And I think that's a message that we really have to get across to people, that we're not saying the Scottish Government washes its hands of any responsibility for the Scottish economy. Of course, it will do everything it can with the powers it has to grow the economy. But ultimately, until you have full independence, then you can't grow your economy as successfully as other small countries are doing. Iceland and Ireland are booming at present, and I visited Ireland earlier this year, Dublin, with the Brexit Select Committee, and I was sitting on the plane reading the briefing that had been prepared by the House of Commons staff. So this is an independent briefing prepared by MPs from all parties, which was noting the very significant growth in the Irish economy. Last year, I think it was 5.9%. This year, it's 7.1%. Compare that to 0.1% in the United Kingdom, or 0.8% as it was for the last year. Now, many people will say to you, the only reason the Irish economy is growing is because the Irish have chosen to have a low corporate tax rate. But that's absolute rubbish. That is one factor in their economic growth. But speaking to Irish politicians and Irish business people, what they will tell you about growth in the Irish economy is down to having a very youthful, well-educated, committed population, and to helping and supporting small business in Ireland. All the things that we should be doing in this country, but we can't do because we don't have the full powers of independence, and we're going to be even more limited in doing when we're dragged out of the European Union against our will. So I think it's very important for us to be able to communicate clearly to people why it is that economic growth is so low in the UK at present compared to other countries. And also when some in the rather biased unionist press try to suggest that Scotland has peculiarly low economic growth, you can actually tell them, if you compare Scotland's economic growth with the other regions of the UK, and Scotland's not treated as a nation, it's treated as a region within the UK in terms of economic growth, then the only sector, the only region ahead of Scotland is London and the South East, which of course really sucks a lot of the wealth into it because things are so dominated by London and the South East, according to the way the economy has been run in recent years, I'm afraid to say, by both Labour as well as Conservative candidates. So I thought I would say a little bit about what my typical week is like for me in the House of Commons and what I'm working on at present. I generally tend to go down on a Monday morning, down to London on a Monday morning, and come back up on a Thursday evening. Parliament doesn't start till 2:30 on a Monday, the idea being to get people who've got far to travel from their constituency to get in. I sometimes go down on a Sunday night, and I'll be doing that tomorrow because I'll probably be doing quite a lot of media on Monday morning because over the Windrush thing, as you're aware, Amber Rudd has had to admit that she either she didn't know about these targets, or she did know about them, or she's not on top of her situation, or whatever the explanation is, she's having to come to Parliament to give a statement about the latest developments at 3:30 on Monday afternoon. So I would anticipate, as the SNP's Home Affairs spokesperson, probably having to do some TV and radio interviews on Monday morning about what the SNP position is on that, and I'll come to that in a moment. But generally speaking, I go down on a Monday morning, and what determines what, and I will go back up on a Thursday night, and what determines what I do from Monday to Thursday very much depends on what the business is down for the House of Commons. And the government will normally announce the business for the following week, the Tuesday or the Wednesday before. And generally speaking, Monday and Tuesday is government business. Wednesday is an opposition day when normally Labour get to choose the topic of debate, but from time to time, as the third party, the SNP gets to choose it. And then Thursday normally tends to be debates on backbench business. But for those of you who are interested in Parliament and watch what my mum refers to as SNP TV, the Parliament channel, you'll see that each day starts with a question session. So one day it'll be defence questions, one day it'll be foreign and Commonwealth Office, one day it'll be Home Affairs, which I'll cover, and I'll cover Justice, because I cover the Home Affairs and the Justice brief. Basically, MPs can table into a ballot to get questions selected for those question sessions, in the same way as every week you can put your name in the ballot for PMQs, but it's very just much a bit of a lottery as to whether your name gets picked out or not. So in addition to what's going on in the chamber, and actually just the tip of the iceberg about what goes on in Westminster in a typical week, there's a secondary debating chamber called Westminster Hall, where debates also take place, more dominated by backbenchers, and quite often an issue that's going to get up ahead of steam will start, for example, the WASPI campaign will start out as a debate in Westminster Hall, and then as it picks up more steam as an issue, will actually get to the floor of the House of Commons. But perhaps the most interesting work that goes on at Westminster is the committee work. And there's two types of committee. There are bill committees which are set up on an ad hoc basis to deal with looking at bills that are going through Parliament in detail and dealing with the amendments to those bills. But there are committees that sit permanently called select committees. And there's a select committee that mirrors each Department of State. So for the Home Office, there's a Home Affairs Select Committee. For the Department of Exiting the European Union, there is a Department of Exiting the European Union Select Committee, and that's the one I sit on. Now, normally the Select Committees have 12 or 13 MPs from cross-party, representing the makeup of the Commons. There's a degree of controversy about that because, of course, the Tories don't actually have a majority, so they shouldn't have a majority on the select committees, but effectively they've ended up with one because of their sort of deal with the DUP. The DUP are getting more seats on select committees than they ever have done before. But on the Brexit Select Committee, because Brexit's such a massive issue, there are actually 21 members of Parliament. So there's two SNP MPs on that, myself and Peter Grant. There's also a Plaid Cymru MP on the Brexit Select Committee, who very much tends to work with myself and Peter, Howell Williams from Plaid Cymru. And of course, although the government the Tories and the DUP representative in theory have a majority, a significant number of the Tories who sit in the Department of Exiting the European Union are Tories who are Remainers and are actually very unhappy about Brexit. And I'm very much sensing that these Tories now are starting to gain their voice and are starting to peel off from the inevitability of leaving the single market and the customs union. And it was just as I was driving over here, I was listening to the end of Any Questions. Tom Newton-Dunn, who is a political journalist for The Sun now, previously The Telegraph, perhaps not our number one fan, but somebody who's got his finger on the pulse of what's going on in Parliament. I don't know if any of you heard it last night or today. He was saying that he really got the sense from the backbench business debate about the customs union on Thursday that quite a lot of backbench Tories are starting to think, we need to stay at least in the customs union. And I think this will now be done on a fight-by-fight basis, get the customs union, and then maybe move on to the single market. But I'll come back to that in a second about what I think is going to happen about Brexit. But what we do on the Select Committee is it's our job to scrutinise what David Davies is doing. Quite an entertaining job, I can tell you, because I don't think he knows what he's doing himself. And he comes every 2 months or so to give evidence to us. But I rather enjoy that because it was get a chance to sort of wind him up a bit. And I have to say that Hilary, as I should have said, each of the Select Committees has a chair. And the way this is done is that there'll be certain Select Committees that have a Conservative chair, and so maybe 2 or 3 Conservatives will stand and there'll be an election and we all get to vote for the one we want. Some will have a Labour chair, as the Brexit Select Committee does, and Hilary Benn's the chair, and 2 have SNP chairs. The Scottish Affairs Committee is chaired by Pete Wishart, and the International Trade Committee is chaired by Angus Brendan McNeill. But I think Hilary Benn came to mind. I think he's actually been very effective in hauling David Davies over the coals. And what's been very interesting about the Brexit Select Committee was when I first joined it, the language of Hilary Benn and was very much, we're all, regardless of whether we were Remainers or Brexiteers, we're all Brexiteers now and we just want the best for our country. Not sure which country he meant, but that language has changed now, and I sense a growing feeling amongst some Labour MPs and some Tory MPs that perhaps, and obviously Lib Dems and SNP, that perhaps Brexit can be stopped. But the question is, how do we go about doing that? I have to say, my own view is, much as I want to see an independent Scotland in the long run, I actually think it's in the interest of Scotland for England to remain in the European Union, or at least to remain in the single market and the customs union, because we're always going to have a special economic relationship with England. I'd like it to be a relationship of equals rather than the relationship that it is at present. But I think it helps if we're both in the same single market. It's not absolutely essential, but I think it would make things easier in the long run. And I also think that whatever differences we may have with the current British government, I think the British, for all their troublemaking in the EU, if you go to Brussels, people will tell you that behind the scenes the British were often very pragmatic and were quite useful, British civil servants anyway, in brokering deals in the EU. So I actually think it's in the interests of us all, including those of us who want to see an independent Scotland, for England to remain in the single market and the customs union. But anyway, on the Brexit Select Committee, what we tend to do is we have a rolling inquiry into the progress of the negotiations, and we publish reports from time to time on what we think is the progress of the negotiations, trying to keep them as polite as we can. It's quite difficult given the progress is so, well, I'll use Angela Merkel's word, curious, not frustrating. She said it was curious, which I thought was rather a wonderful understatement. So we have a rolling programme, and what we do is we take evidence not just from politicians. So Mike Russell will be called to give us evidence, or Drakeford from the Welsh Government, and obviously David Davies. But we also will have people from the business world, people from NGOs, people from the academic world, people from the medical world, coming to talk to us about the impact of Brexit on their particular line of work. We've taken evidence from people representing EU nationals living in the United Kingdom and people representing British citizens living in other EU 27 countries. So we'll take evidence from them and then we'll prepare reports from time to time. We also had a rolling inquiry into the progress of the EU withdrawal bill, and obviously Peter Grant and I worked hard to make sure that there were detailed chapters in that report about the impact on devolution. And I really don't think, if the SNP MPs weren't there, there wouldn't be a detailed inquiry by that committee into devolution, because how can I put this politely? I find the ignorance amongst a lot of English MPs about the devolution settlements quite staggering. But I don't mean that in a rude way, because perhaps it's not their premier concern. Why would they? Their premier concern is their own constituencies. But I'll give you an example. When junior immigration minister, Caroline Noakes, when she was giving evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee, which at present is having an inquiry into having a different immigration system for Scotland, and she said that she wouldn't want to give the Scottish Parliament any powers that she wouldn't give to Lincolnshire County Council. And I thought, in addition to being rather rude, that was also an indication of her staggering ignorance about the devolution settlement that we all voted for in 1997. I say we all, but 75% of people who voted for that. And all credit to Donald Dewar. It was a great scheme because everything was devolved unless it was specifically reserved. And I think one of the problems about the Scotland Act that followed the vow and us losing the independence referendum was the Tories have now got into this pattern of shaving little bits of powers and giving us a little bit of power in relation to taxation, a little bit of power in relation to social security. And I really do worry that that is going to be something of a trap for us in the long run. And one of the reasons why I think the SNP must always keep its eyes on our reason for existing, which is to deliver an independent Scotland, rather than just managing devolution. Because I think there will come a time when we can't manage devolution efficiently, and in a sense we'll be hoisted by our own petard if we make that the only thing that we do. And I think it's very important that whilst we respect the result of the 2014 independence referendum, that doesn't mean to say that we can't still keep arguing for what we believe is the right thing for Scotland going forward. And if you think back to September 2014, which to me now seems rather a long time ago, particularly personally for me because my life has changed so much since then, so many of the things that seemed stable and unlikely to change then have changed. And I'll give you a classic example. I remember, some of you will know I set up an organisation called Lawyers for Yes during the independence referendum, and then somebody set up a Lawyers for No, and we had a big debate in Edinburgh, which was very well attended, and it got quite heated. And from the platform, speaking about why I supported independence, as somebody who's always been a passionate Europhile, I said, first of all, that if the Conservatives won the next election, there was a significant possibility that Scotland would be dragged out of the European Union against her will because they were committed to holding a referendum, and I actually thought there was a good chance that they would lose it. I was howled down. A woman at the back of the room howled with rage at me suggesting such an outrageous thing and said I was distorting the truth and this would never happen. Of course, Labour were going to win the next election. Later on in the same meeting on the issue of human rights, which is also an issue I really care about, I said, and you do realise that the Conservatives want to repeal the Human Rights Act and take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. Again, howled down by the same woman from the back of the room. I won't say who she is. I met her recently and she apologised to me and said, you were right. And she's changed her mind from no to yes. And there's quite a few people in the legal world that I know have changed from no to yes as a result of these two big policies that the British government were stuck with, their attitude towards human rights and their attitude towards Brexit. So that's how the Brexit Select Committee works. And I think one of the great opportunities for myself and Peter Grant and being in that committee is the access it gives us to people who we wouldn't otherwise have access to. And I suppose this comes me back to an issue which I think sometimes the SNP ought to spend a bit more time addressing. Why do we have MPs at Westminster? We've got a devolved parliament now, and clearly Holyrood is the vehicle for change in Scotland, particularly as we've been in power there for so long. So I think one of the reasons we didn't do so well in last year's general election was we failed as a party to articulate to voters in Scotland what use it is having SNP MPs at Westminster. And in 2015, we got elected on the back of that slogan, Stronger for Scotland, and we tried to recycle it again last year. But in actual fact, we needed to explain more what it was that we had been doing as a group and why it's useful for us to be there. Because of course, on one level, you might say, why do we bother at all? Because we can always be outvoted. If there is a government at Westminster that is unionist and has a majority behind it, then even if you had 59, even if every seat in Scotland sent an SNP MP to Westminster, we could always be outvoted as a group. So you might say, why do we bother going at all? And I think there will come a point in the future, perhaps if we don't get independence in the next 5 years, that the SNP may need to address the issue of why we go to Westminster, whether we go at all. Should we consider being an abstentionist party like Sinn Féin? Although, of course, Sinn Féin have a very, very different history from us and have only recently come to constitutional nationalism, which, of course, has been what the SNP has had in its DNA from its very founding. But I think these are things that we should discuss. But for now, I'm very much of the view that it's extremely useful for us to have as many SNP MPs at Westminster as possible because of the access it gives us to influencers that we wouldn't otherwise have. For example, Holyrood has no competence in the area of foreign affairs. Now, nevertheless, the Scottish Government has opened up business hubs in Paris, in Dublin, in London, just opened one in Berlin last week. And these will be very much centres for us to influence and gain friends in other European capitals. But while we have SNP MPs at Westminster, it gives us an access to the foreign offices of other countries and foreign MPs in a way that we don't have really in the same way through Holyrood, because Holyrood doesn't have the same powers. So for example, as a result of being on the Brexit Select Committee, Peter and I have been able to go backwards and forwards to Brussels regularly with that committee and have complete access to Michel Barnier. I mean, I've asked Michel Barnier many, and this is off the record stuff, sometimes it doesn't go into the report, many questions about his position in relation to Scotland. Equally, at the European Parliament, we've direct access to Guy Verhofstadt. I can go in there and discuss with him and make sure that these people know what's going on, make sure that they understand the detail of what's going on in relation to the EU withdrawal bill and Clause 11. Because if we're not sending people out to these European capitals to speak to politicians in France and Germany, for example, then the only people that are speaking to them are representatives of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and they will necessarily be giving a unionist understanding of what the position is in Scotland. And I think this very much affected us back in 2014. I think a lot of us were a bit upset that we didn't have more friends in other European nation states. Hopefully I'll be forgiven for saying that even the Irish didn't really give us much support in 2014, but boy has that changed now. I mean, you saw the reception Nicola Sturgeon got when she went to Dublin last year, and I can tell you that as an SNP MP, the red carpet is rolled out as soon as you step off the plane in Dublin. Maybe not quite so much in France and Germany, but En Marche and these new MPs in Paris, who I think have a lot in common with us as SNP MPs. A lot of them, like me, came from a job, never expected to be a politician. I've now got very good access to them as a result of being on that committee, and I can discuss with them the SNP view of events and put to them the view which is supported, of course, by the majority of Scottish voters. We have the biggest section of the vote in Scotland, and I'm able to put that over. Equally, my colleagues on other select committees, when they're travelling abroad on committee business, are able to put the Scottish position. And we had a very funny incident recently in a meeting with some politicians from Eastern Europe when somebody, a very senior Labour MP who shall remain nameless, after myself and Peter had made some sort of nationalist points to these visiting Eastern European politicians, a very senior Labour MP who shall remain nameless then went on to make rather a pompous speech about the dangers of nationalism and the dangers of separation. Whereupon the leader of the Slovakian delegation put his hand up and said, well, you know, we actually have found out that we've got on much better with our big next door neighbour since we became independent. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with your take on that, Mr. Ben, I mean, whatever his name was. So it has been a great opportunity for us to reach out to politicians from other countries. So, what about Spain? Well, I was going to come on to that, but I'll take that question now. Yes, well, what about Spain? I mean, clearly the current Spanish government, the Parti Popular, are very, so just to put it politely, very displeased with the Scottish National Party and the Scottish government at present. But if you look back to 2014, Spain was always seen as the fly in the ointment. Because if you're joining the European Union as a new member state, every other member state has to agree to that. And you'll know that, forgive me if I'm saying something that's very obvious. And it was always held up that Spain would veto Scotland's membership of the European Union. Of course, Barroso, under the Barroso Commission, that was very much the line. That line has very much changed under the Juncker Commission, and you'll remember in the void that followed after the EU referendum, when the Tory government more or less collapsed in on itself here, Labour were divided, there was a period of weeks where Nicola Sturgeon was the only strong voice speaking from within the British Isles. And of course she went to Brussels, and was that famous time when Juncker said Scotland has earned the right to be heard in Brussels. And I think, generally speaking, there's considerably more sympathy for our situation now across the other member states. I think many people back in 2014 who weren't terribly well informed about the political situation in Scotland saw those of us who wanted a yes vote as troublemakers who were breaking up the United Kingdom and couldn't understand why we would want to do that. Now, as a result of the Brexit votes, knowing that the majority of Scots, very significant majority, voted to remain but are being forced out against their will, there's a much greater understanding in European capitals amongst European politicians of why it is that Scotland might want to go its separate way. To get back to the Spanish question, we certainly, by supporting the Catalonian right to self-determination and by criticising the way that the Spanish government are using these European arrest warrants to pick politicians up across Europe, I certainly don't think we've strengthened our case with the current Spanish government. But what I will say is this: there are a number of litigations ongoing in European member states at the moment about these European arrest warrants. We've got one here in Scotland. There's one in Germany, and I believe there may be one in Belgium. I think it's highly likely that one or more of those courts will make a reference to the Court of Justice about the appropriateness of using a European arrest warrant essentially to pick up your political opponents who are causing you a hard time and put them in prison. I think this raises very real rights issues. Equally, there are very real rule of law issues about what's going on in Spain at the moment, the extent to which the executive seem to be directing prosecutions and influencing the Spanish judiciary. Now, this isn't just pie in the sky coming from me. There was a case in Ireland in March where an Irish judge refused to extradite a Polish citizen to Poland under a European arrest warrant because she said that she was concerned about human rights and rule of law issues in Poland. Now, as some of you may know, the Poles are in the middle of rewriting their constitution, and there's very real concern at the heart of the European Union that the way that they're rewriting their constitution is going to undermine the independence of the judiciary. And so the Irish judge refused to extradite the Polish gentleman on that basis, and she's referred the case to the Court of Justice. And I suspect that at least one or more of the Catalonian cases will go to the Court of Justice. And I think it's such an important issue. The Court of Justice in Luxembourg will convene a grand chamber, like all the judges, to look at the issue. And I think it is likely that there will be criticism of the way that the Spanish state has behaved on a rights basis, not political criticism, a rights, rule of law based criticism. I think that may undermine the strength of Spain's voice in the European Union. Equally, there's the Gibraltar question. Before I got involved in politics, I always kind of thought, don't want to be rude about Gibraltar now because I've grown rather fond of it, but I always thought Gibraltar was full of a sort of bunch of crazy expats who wrapped themselves in Union Jack, were a bit bonkers. But now that I've actually learnt about it, I realise that there are very good historical reasons why Gibraltar has a separate identity. And in fact, many people who live in Gibraltar see themselves as very British, although many of them are of Italian or Portuguese or Maltese descent. But of course, when it looked like the Labour government back in the early 90s was going to negotiate behind Gibraltar's back to pool sovereignty with Spain, the Gibraltar people themselves held what was described by the then British government as an illegal referendum to say that they didn't want that. And many Conservative and Labour MPs went out as observers to Gibraltar's illegal referendum. So last year, when I was being slagged off by some people on the Tory front bench for going out to observe the Catalonian illegal referendum, I pointed out they'd done the same thing 20 years previously for Gibraltar. But the reason I digress into this is Gibraltar voted, I think, something like 99% that it wants sovereignty to remain with the UK. It also voted 98% to remain in the European Union. So it now finds itself in a very curious position. But I think as I understand it now, having met the Prime Minister of Gibraltar a couple of times, another representative of his government, and they come to SNP conference because they're very keen to lobby the SNP and make sure we understand their position. Their position is really dominated by wanting to run their own affairs, but they'd rather remain affiliated with the United Kingdom rather than with Spain because they fear Spanish democracy, and they fear particularly what they've seen in Catalonia about desires for autonomy while under Spanish sovereignty. So I think as the Brexit mess unravels, the problem of Gibraltar has sort of been pushed off to the side because Northern Ireland's such a massive problem. It's a problem about preserving peace. But I think when the problem of Gibraltar comes to the fore, as these Catalonian legal cases proceed to the courts, I think the current Spanish government may have less respect in the European Union than it holds at present. That doesn't completely solve our problem, but I think it goes some way towards giving me comfort. And I suppose, I wrestled with this when I was asked to go as an observer to the Catalonian independence referendum. I thought, if I go out there and, participate in this referendum, which the Spanish are saying is illegal, and I'm seen to be supportive of the notion that the Catalonians have a right to self-determination, then am I damaging the cause of Scottish independence because it's going to make the Spanish government even less likely to want to accede to Scotland coming into the European Union? And I suppose the answer I gave at the end of the day was sometimes you just have to do the right thing. You know, I thought of how upset I was in 2014 when other European nations didn't seem to acknowledge Scotland's right for self-determination and treated us like a bunch of troublemakers. And I thought perhaps the Catalonians deserved my support. And I think that's a view that the Scottish Government has come round to. Not that we should dictate what happens in Catalonia, or that we should even necessarily embrace the Catalonian independence movement, but we have to stand up for the right of them to make their decision and to have a legal and constitutional referendum to determine their future. Anyway, I don't want to rabble on for too long because I want to take some more questions, but I'll say a bit about the Joint Committee on Human Rights, because that's been a bit of a baby of mine since I got elected as an MP, in the sense that I was enraged that there were no SNP representatives on it in the last Parliament. Now, it's called the Joint Committee on Human Rights because it's a joint committee of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, so it has peers on it as well as MPs. And its duty is to scrutinise all legislation that's going through the House of Parliament for human rights issues, so it has a very broad remit. And I think it's fair to say that when the 56 were first elected 3 years ago, there was huge antipathy towards us from the Labour Party, as we were seen as having, I once heard Dennis Skinner. I heard someone asking Dennis Skinner where his friend was, and some Labour MP from Lanarkshire, and he said, "He's not here, some wee lassie stole his seat." Sorry, it's a Scottish accent rather than a Dennis Skinner accent. So there was that very much the idea that we had stolen their friends' seats and that somehow we were ghastly, mad separatists. And I think there was just pretty much a cabal with the Tories to make sure we didn't get a seat on that committee. And I made several speeches about it and moaned about it a lot, so much that somebody once tweeted, "Oh, there's Joanna Cherry moaning again because she's not got a seat in the Human Rights Committee." Anyway, after this election, they fixed it so there would be an SNP person on it. And Harriet Harman, very kindly, who chairs it, came and asked me if I'd like to sit in it. So I said yes. And it's actually a really interesting committee because, well, its makeup, I mean, Doreen Lawrence sits on the Joint Committee of Human Rights. Stephen Lawrence's mum, who's been in the House of Lords for a few years. Harry Wolff, a very distinguished and liberal English judge, sits on it. And for me, it's really interesting to get to work with him. And as well as looking at all the legislation that's going through and publishing reports on human rights issues, and we've been very, very critical of the Brexit legislation in relation to the withdrawal, basically chunking all EU law over into the domestic legal systems apart from the Charter and fundamental rights. But we also carry out inquiries. We just did a big inquiry on freedom of speech in universities and published a report about the importance of preserving freedom of speech in universities. Our concern that no platforming, which was a thing very much, I think, developed by students of my generation to maybe keep the British National Party and fascists off the stage, is now being used as an excuse to silence people whose views perhaps aren't fashionable or don't fit with the current, what's viewed as currently fashionable. We did a report on that. At the moment, we're doing a big inquiry into the enforcement of rights. You know, it's all very well to have all these rights and to have a Human Rights Act, but if you can't actually afford to go to court or to go to a tribunal, you don't have any means of enforcing those rights. And this is a really, really big issue in England because legal aid has been so drastically cut in England. In a way, it hasn't in Scotland. And I mean, I'd probably be strung up if some of my former colleagues heard me saying this, but I actually think we have a great legal aid system in Scotland. Okay, lawyers don't make a lot of money out of it, but legal aid is very widely available. There are huge areas in England where you just can't get legal aid. You can't get legal aid in a personal injury case, you can't get legal aid in a medical negligence case, you can't get legal aid in immigration cases, you can't get legal aid in family law cases. So in Scotland, we still have legal aid in all of those areas. And that's not just SNP propaganda. There was an independent review of the Scottish legal aid system. It was published at the end of March. And it said that we have one of the best legal aid systems in Europe, that for less spend per capita than is spent in England, we have a much broader eligibility criteria. 70% of people in Scotland are eligible for legal aid to some extent. And the scope of litigation it covers is much wider. So this is an opportunity again of having SNP MPs at Westminster, where Angus Robertson used to always refer to it as the charm offensive, whereby we can show that there is stuff that the Scottish Government does really well. So I've been able to question witnesses on this. You know, how does this can you see, the comparison between legal aid in Scotland and England, and do you think England would benefit from an independent review? Because there's a government-led review of legal aid going on in England just now. But I think what the majority of witnesses to the Joint Committee on Human Rights would want to see is an independent review, so that perhaps legal aid could become more widely available, or recommendations could be made to that effect, as it is in Scotland. So, these are the opportunities, and again, in the area I speak on in justice, there are many good examples of reforms in Scotland, which in actual fact the British government is looking at the reforms we've carried out in short sentences to stop sending people to prison for 6 months and to give them community payback orders instead, because all the evidence shows that if rather than sending somebody to prison for 6 months, you actually give them a community payback order and they do work in the community, they're far less likely to re-offend. And that's one of the reasons the crime rate's dropping in Scotland. And that is recognised by the Tories at Westminster, and they're actually looking at introducing a similar system. So we are able to create opportunities to counter the narrative which suggests that the Scottish Government's making a mess of domestic policy in Scotland. So that's another opportunity that we have. Another opportunity we have as SNP MPs, and I'll just say this quickly before I take some questions, is of course that we ourselves are able to use all the great resources of Westminster, the research resources in the library, soon to be augmented by David Torrance, and the short money that we get as a result of being the third party to help us inform our work and the policies we're pushing forward. And last year, I and 3 other SNP colleagues, just before the snap general election was called, went to Canada to study the immigration system in Canada. Because as you probably know, although immigration is a federal power in Canada, they allow the individual provinces to run different immigration schemes. And this was very much driven by Quebec. Obviously, Quebec wanted to have visas for people from the Francophonie, French speakers, to keep their Francophone culture and identity. But when Quebec started getting that, other provinces were like, well, we'd like to have, we need people, just like Scotland, we need more people to come and work in this area. And so we've produced a report about that, and we're very much hoping to do a fringe event at the SNP conference in June, talking about the information we gathered on this study trip. And again, it's something we've really been able to push in committees and discussions. When people say, oh, you could never have, as long as the UK remains the UK, you have to have the same immigration rules across the whole of the UK. We're able to point to Canada and say it actually works really well in Canada, not having the same rules. There are teething problems and issues around the edges. So yes, again, that's been a great opportunity, I think, that we have as a result of having SNP MPs at Westminster. So I'll maybe just wind up there.
I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking Joanna for her time this afternoon.
Thanks.